Hey, welcome. My name is Vince Moscatello, and I've been tasked with the role of presenting my investigation findings to you, the community, into what has become known as one of the world's worst maritime disasters, and that is the sinking of the Titanic. The aim of this presentation is to provide you, firstly, a brief background of the Titanic, present the findings from a lot of the data that's out in the public currently, and basically relate it back to 2019 and give you an overview of that. So we'll get straight into it. So as a brief background, the Titanic was built back in Belfast in 1909, and it was owned by a company called White Star Line, and they originally commissioned Harland and Wolff to build the ship, and it was completed in 1912 and set off on its maiden voyage, which was supposed to be a return trip from Britain to America, and the date was April 10th, 1912. Now, as we know from the data and what's happened in history, that 4 days into that maiden voyage, April 14th, 1912, and that was just before midnight, the ship, the Titanic, struck an iceberg, which ultimately caused her sinking. And it only took 2 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to disappear into the sea, killing 1,502 passengers on board, of a total of 2,224. So almost over 2/3 of the passengers. It's a tragic event. So from that tragic event, we have a lot of data that's come out. So what do we actually know? Well, we know that 1,502 of the 2,224 passengers died. But the question remains, why did so many actually die? So using the information available, and many people along the way have summarized the available information into easy and understandable graphical representations of the information. And from these graphical representations, we can easily see correlations between different variables when compared to survival rate, or even when compared to death rates. And thus we needed to investigate further to understand what was actually occurring, and whether that information could be relevant for 2019. So let's have a look at the data that's been widely published in many different formats. So we'll start with this first infographic. So this is probably one of the better ones that we have out in the public at the moment. And this was completed by Barr and Johnson. And what it is, it's obvious it's a graphical representation of the data of some of the variables versus the survival rate on the Titanic. So across the top, we can see there's different variables being used. So there's survival rate broken down against sex and cabin class and even age, and even compared two variables at the same time to find further correlations, such as like gender and class compared to the death rate. And we can also see at the bottom some of the lifeboats. So the lifeboats is a great graphic representation showing how many that were on board, and there was 20. And the blue represents the capacity at which those lifeboats were deployed, and also states the time each of those lifeboats were deployed. So we have all this data that's visually available to us, but what does it actually tell us? So when we look at the raw numbers without comparing any of the variables, we know that more men died than women. But when we break that down into the different variables available, from analysing the data further, we get a better understanding of what actually influenced the survival rate. So, for example, firstly, women and children were more likely to survive compared to men. Now, we know from first accounts from people who did survive the Titanic that this was due to the fact that women and children were prioritised over men onto lifeboats, and thus that obviously increased their survival rate. The data also analysed other variables to find correlations. Other variables such as cabin class and their effect on survival rate, even things like proximity people had to lifeboats, the age and gender compared to survival rates. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this was a tragic disaster where, as I mentioned, more than 2/3 of the people perished. So we need to use this data to try to prevent future tragedies. So here's another example of a graphical representation of the data, and this is really focused on the cabin class and sex of passengers on board compared to their survival rate. So we can see clearly that if you were a woman and first class, traveling in the first class cabin, you had a very, very high chance of survival, whereas conversely, on the other side of the scale, if you were male and traveling either second or third class cabin, it meant a much lower chance of survival. So the question remains, we have all this data and we found these findings, but how can we use that today? So although we have all this data at hand, we need to analyze the different variables of data to find correlations, and in this case, measure the different variables to ascertain the survival rate amongst the passengers. So the data can also be used today to help us essentially in a modern day way of improving efficiency. So we can use this data to run different simulations, for example, and predict the different survival rates by manipulating some of the different variables that we know from the data from the Titanic. This can help predict who was most likely to survive, knowing what we know now post the accident. And this can form the basis of which passengers would have actually survived. So ultimately, the goal would be to use that data that would minimize the loss of life on the Titanic. So we manipulate those variables to get that result. So then we can employ these lessons today and find out what we can improve in today's instances to reduce the loss of life in such an event. And I guess this is where data plays a significant role in help improving or reducing the impact of such a tragic event could happen again. So let's relate this back to today's ships. So although there is still a small risk that ships today could potentially hit an iceberg, and the chance of this is obviously quite low, the reason this is, I guess, quite low now is because more data is available to ships, and a lot of this data is actually analysed in real time. So for example, today's ships utilise radars to track icebergs in real time. They also track them via satellites from space, their movements and their patterns. So therefore, in today's terms, this would significantly reduce the risk of a 2019 ship hitting an iceberg, as per the case in what happened with the Titanic. There's also many other factors that will reduce the risk of a similar event happening today, especially around modern safety laws. So using the data from the Titanic, we know, for example, that there was only 20 lifeboats on board, and those lifeboats were only enough for 1,178 people. So there was actually 2,224 people on board. So there was never enough lifeboats for everyone to get off, only for 53% of the passengers if they were all deployed at capacity. So we know this is not the case. So we've used that data to improve the efficiency today. So today's boats, we carry a capacity of 125% as a bare minimum of the number of passengers on board, and often ships will actually exceed that number. So this is one of the things that can ease the community's mind in knowing that if a tragic event were to happen and you're on a ship, at least there would be enough lifeboats to save all the passengers. So that's the end of my investigation into the Titanic disaster. So in summary, we know what occurred was a tragedy. We need to use this tragedy and the data gathered from this event to analyse the different variables so that correlations can be formed between these variables and survival rate, and seeing if we can use that data to help model for today's ships. And we can do that by the way of simulations, and that can help better prepare us for the future and also change practices around safety, for example, the more lifeboats on today's ships. And also today we have a lot more technology at hand, a lot more real-time data that's been analysed on the fly on the ships directly. So because of this, such as satellites and radar, this is going to greatly reduce the chance of an adverse event occurring. So from a community perspective, they can be rest assured that ships today are a lot more safer to what happened back in the day when the Titanic did sink. Thank you very much.